Okay, good afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm your professor for this class, Dr. Randy Kearns, and our topic this week will include wildfires. And just a couple of things I want to be sure and go over. Let's talk about assignments that are due, but just one particular overhead I want to mention regarding the topic, and that is I do recognize in at least the southeastern Louisiana, we're not typically threatened by wildfire. This is more of a lecture as it relates to other parts of the country you may live in or other parts of the world you may live in. So there will be obviously some pertinent information as it relates to that. We'll talk a little bit about business continuity as well as personal preparedness. But let me pause just a minute and pull up our assignments for the week to be sure I don't miss anything there. Okay, so as far as assignments this week, week of April 12th, I've got a couple of short videos that I do think would be good for you to spend just a couple of minutes looking at how quickly wildfire can get out of control and can cut off your opportunities to evacuate the area. So particularly if you're living in an area that's more prone to wildfire, or if you wind up moving there, and I'm talking about particularly states out west like California, Wyoming, Colorado to a lesser extent, Montana, Idaho, and to somewhat of a lesser extent, Oregon and Washington. And actually the state with the greatest number of wildfires is the state of Alaska. Because there's a lot fewer people who live there, we don't hear as much about the effort underway to control certain wildfires in the state. But by far and away, that's the most active state of the 50 US states with wildfires. So I've got a short video I would like for you to watch. If you don't know anything about the Hot Shots program, I think that also can give you a little bit of background into what goes into firefighting as it relates to wildfire, and particularly remote and areas that are difficult to access because of terrain. And again, just a couple of other wildfire videos that I've included. This is another one of the firefighter hot shots, again parachuting into an area that they're going to attack the fire from a specific location. I also included just a short video on what causes dry lightning, which is one of the other than man's carelessness, wildfires being caused by dry lightning is another source, another primary source. And then also had a couple of videos included in patient movement. Again, normally if we were in the classroom, patient movement would be a part of this week's assignments. I would ask you to go over this. Again, there's no skills that we're going to be able to do in the classroom, but it is something that I think is important that's a part of the content for this week. And then last but not least, there's a 20-question quiz related specifically to the content in wildfire. And just as I had included a personal preparedness article from the New York Times that was related to hurricanes, I've also included one related to wildfire. We also have a discussion forum this week. Again, first post by Friday night, final post by Sunday night. And I think that's it. Let me pause this just a minute. Okay, now we're back. Now with that, let's go ahead and get into the presentation for this week. So just a couple of points again about wildfire. We're far more likely to have to deal with that in areas where there's lower humidity, there's significant opportunity for gust of winds, Closer to the Pacific is certainly one of those areas. Now, I will say that that there have been so the primary firefighting organization that's involved in wildfire suppression in many cases is the U.S. Forest Service, and the U.S. Forest Service is involved because of the number of areas that are particularly in the western part of the United States that are considered a part of the U.S. Forest Service. Again, there's a lot of local fire suppression, particularly as you get into California. There's a lot of local fire suppression, and then to a much lesser extent, there's also the threat of wildfire in the North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia mountains. But again, in areas where there's more moisture associated with humidity, the likelihood of wildfire and developing extremely dry vegetation and creating those conditions that make it more prone to wildfire are less likely. So as we look at some of our key terms, a backfire is a method of trying to stop a wildfire, and the intent with backfire is to set a fire in an area that will allow the fuel to be absorbed before the much larger fire gets to that area. It's also known as a burnout. The smoke jumpers that I mentioned earlier, that's one of their particular means or strategies of trying to divert a fire. And if you can divert a fire back into itself so that it burns up all of the fuel, but then there's no place for it to go, that's certainly an effective strategy that does work at times. Obviously, you need favorable winds or a wind direction to change for that to help, but that's a common strategy. Convection current, before I talk too much about it, I've got a slide that shows that a little bit better. Dry lightning, I mentioned that earlier. There's a good video, very short clip that's on the website, that's on the Moodle page, that I think is a great example of how dry lightning occurs. Fire weather red flag warnings. So just as we hear about tornado watches and warnings from NOAA, actually, if you live in an area that's more prone to wildfire, you will also hear fire weather red flag watches and warnings with very similar frequency to what we hear if we live in areas that are more prone to tornadoes. A watch may be issued for the next 12 hours, but not more than 72 hours, and typically the next 12 to 48 hours. The warning is where conditions are imminent for a potential fire weather pattern. Humidity, as I mentioned before, plays a significant role in the threat of wildfire. As humidity goes up, moisture in the air increases, and the likelihood of fire goes down. As humidity goes down, the drier the air and the greater the likelihood of fire. Topography is how the natural land around us is arranged. When we talk about changes in topography, what we're doing is we're looking at elevation changes, and particularly fire is far more likely to move up a hill than it is to move down a hill. It much more slowly moves down a hill. And so again, when we talk about either when you see slides about hotshots using backfire or firefighters using backfire as a strategy, a part of that is also relying on topography to help them with that. Wildfire, also known as a brush fire, is just a general term that we use for areas involving forest, grasslands, or prairie, but natural areas outside of what's typically the more urban or suburban communities that people are more likely to live. And then as development continues to push out into a lot of these far less developed areas, that's what's referred to as the wildland urban interface. And as that zone expands, where we get further and further into areas that in some cases people have not built homes, the greater the likelihood that there may be wildfire potential in those areas. It also depends on if it's a property that's managed by the U.S. National Forest Service. The United States Forest Service actually does a number of controlled burns, and the whole purpose to do the controlled burn is to strip away a lot of the dry fuel that would be used to fuel some of these much larger fires. So if you do control burns every 3, 5, 7 years, depending on the type of fuel it is and the type of composition of the material it is, it'll keep that area burned away and minimize the likelihood of much larger and more sustained wildfires. So anyway, this is a great example of convection current. And the best way to understand that is how heat transfers, and again, moving across combustible vegetation, and how it moves up a hill. It's if you've never seen anything like this, wildfire moving up a hill can in some cases be very dramatic and very rapid, and how quickly the fire can spread up a hill will also depend on, again, what type of winds are involved, but it's far more likely for it to move up a hill much faster than it'll move down the hill on the other side. Now, the challenge with as it moves up a hill, it's also throwing lots of hot embers into the air, and as gravity would have it, they're going to come back down at some point. And depending on how dry the area, again, if humidity has been low and the area has been affected by drought for an extended period of time, there's a lot of fuel on the ground that those hot embers can come in contact with and ignite hot spots on the other side of the mountain. And that's how these, 10-acre fires can suddenly become 200-acre fires to 2,000-acre fires almost overnight. Again, depending on the winds, the humidity, the topography, and how much development has gone on. The advantage and disadvantage of development. The advantage is, in most cases, people remove a lot of the material that builds up over time that can cause a wildfire to accelerate. Or if they really like the natural look, in some cases they may be leaving behind a lot of the material that again dries out and becomes fuel for a wildfire. Also, the construction of their home. Later on, we'll talk a little bit about that in personal preparedness. What are things that you can do to minimize that? There's a number of building codes that have been put into place over the last several years in some communities to also help reduce the contribution to the size of the fire by changing construction materials and homes being built closer to the wildfire urban interface, those bounds of demarcation where the boundaries are a lot closer. So again, two most common types of causes. If it's a natural cause, it's more likely to be dry lightning. If it's a human cause, it's more likely to be smoking, a campfire left unattended or not completely extinguished, yard waste, fireworks, in some cases just intentional mischief that can lead to, again, catastrophic outcomes. So a number of these are common sense things in terms of how to prevent wildfire. Certainly being mindful of what the weather conditions are, if you're going to use fire to clear away vegetation, or if you're using, if you're camping and you're doing some outdoors activities. Again, just know what the weather conditions are, what the fire conditions are like in the area where you're at. It can quickly lead to a catastrophic outcome if you're not careful. And so I mentioned this before, but things that contribute to the size of the wildfire and how quickly it can spread. Certainly the size of the fire will give you an idea of what type of damage it can cause, but humidity, weather, and wind direction. And then the landscape, what type of materials are there for it to burn, the geography and topography. Again, topography giving you a different, giving you an idea of what the different levels or layers are. If you look at a map called a topo map that's got lines on it, it'll give you an idea of how tall different parts of the property or different parts of the land is that may be involved in the fire. When a lot of years ago, I was involved in firefighting and response and search and rescue. And a part of that included, we used a lot of, if you have military experience, you've used a topo map. The topography maps help you understand, again, what areas where the lines are really tight together, that tells you those areas are really steep. And where the lines are much further apart, that tells you the areas are a lot more flatter. And again, if we're from a firefighting standpoint, if we're trying to set up a defense, we're trying to look at areas that we can either get into and plow and create kind of a safety break around the fire. Again, my experience was in the eastern United States, where our size of fires was much smaller. We were far less likely to get involved. Our idea of a large wildfire was a 10-acre fire, 15-acre fire. You know, what they're dealing with out west is just almost unimaginable at times, and as to how big it can become and how quickly it can become that big. And so part of it, again, gets back to understanding where you live and where you choose to live in the future. Well, one thing that we really don't think about is once a wildfire occurs, it's stripped away a lot of the vegetation that normally holds the dirt, the earth in place, and a substantial side effect of a catastrophic wildfire in the coming weeks or months shortly thereafter could include landslides, mudslides, and flooding, simply because all the vegetation has been stripped away that would normally collect and hold some of that moisture during excessive rainfalls, instead of just allowing it to free flow off of the mountain or off of the hills. And this is where the National Weather Service issues fire weather watch and fire weather warning. Sometimes they're also referred to as red flag watch and red flag warning. If you're close to a national forest or you're close to a state forest, you'll also see the fire danger signs. That's pretty common. Again, one of the places that I worked in the past, about a third of our county was a part of the URA National Forest. And so we had an ongoing routine interface with National Forest Rangers. And so the U.S. Forest Rangers constantly kept us apprised of what was going on, what were they doing that was prescribed burns. We also had state forest rangers in our area, and they also had firefighting equipment. So if we had large fires, we had a lot of response that really wasn't involved with the local community fire departments. Certainly they would provide manpower. Just understand those trucks, for them to pump a lot of water, they need access to water. And a lot of the rural, remote areas where these fires occur, there's not a lot of water that's available there. So it really compounds the firefighting problems. Watches and warnings, again, just things that I've talked about before, how quickly this can pop up. Just pay attention to this if you're in an area that's more prone to wildfire. If you are, be sure you have an evacuation plan. If you're, again, if you're traveling and you want to go to Yosemite, or you want to go to some of the large national parks or national forests out west, it's a great trip to take, and it's an extraordinary view, an extraordinary experience. Just understand, if you're there during the peak of fire season particularly, and even if you're not, just be mindful of, here again, the further we get back east of the Mississippi, the more likely we are to see lots of roads, lots of development, and a much lower opportunity for seeing a wildfire of substantial size. But the further you get out in the western part of the United States, the more likely you are to see something like this. And so again, it's a matter of knowing the area that you're going into and knowing what the threats or the risks are if you're there. And again, the National Weather Service, just as they issue tornado watches and warnings here in Louisiana, or hurricane watches and warnings, if you're in one of the western states and there's a red flag watch or a red flag warning, or a wildfire watch or a wildfire warning, the National Weather Service also issues that, and that information is available in the same way. Yeah, the firefighting strategies, as I mentioned earlier, it really depends on the setting. We didn't have smoke jumpers, and they're typically, the smoke jumpers are isolated to states like Alaska, Washington, Oregon, California, Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, probably the Dakotas, although I don't have any firefighting experience there. I do have friends that were involved in firefighting in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. And so again, depending on what they may see and how quickly they may see it will depend on what type of resources they need. Again, in some of these really remote areas, it's very difficult to, if it's not threatening anything, in some cases, they're going to allow it to burn, and they, again, may look at deploying strategies on how to set up backfires to burn out the vegetation, so that if there's no fuel for this much larger fire as it gets to it. If you can set a series of small fires that then burn themselves out before the larger fire gets to that area, then there's no fuel left for the larger fire. That only works if you don't have high wind conditions. If you have high wind conditions, you're in trouble. Smoke jumpers do a great job of getting into a targeted area. Again, I've got a couple of really neat videos that show you what the hot shots do and what they go through. As incredibly crazy as it sounds to think about somebody jumping out of a plane, they're jumping out of a plane into a fire or out in front of a fire to set up, again, either backfires or try and divert the fire away from a given area. And then what type of firefighting equipment may be involved. So trucks have, a typical fire truck has between 500 and 1,000 gallons of water. The larger tankers may carry several thousand gallons of water. Just understand that doesn't last very long. In fact, most trucks have the ability to pump all of the water in that tank out of the truck in less than a minute if they're operating at capacity. So why is the water there to begin with? It's to knock down a fire until you can connect to a hydrant. Well, I live here in New Orleans. There's a hydrant almost in front of my house, and one down at the end of the corner and one at the next corner. And if you live in an urban area, there are hydrants all over the place, and that's the way most fire trucks are designed to deal with fires in those areas. The further you get away from a water supply, a central water supply, the less likely you are to have hydrants. And by the time you're in remote areas like national forest or national parks, there's typically not hydrants in those areas. So the only way that they can find a water source is typically with a lake. And if they've pre-identified those lakes, they probably put in something called a dry hydrant. The point is, it's a way that they can pull water out of the lake without actually having to drop a hose off in the lake and suck water out of the lake. There's, again, they've pre-designated areas, and they've got places that they can set up and draft water out of the lake. But that still takes time, and again, there's something called a water shuttle service where they set up a drop tank, and they drop a significant amount of water into that tank, and then they suck water out of that drop tank. Well, they have to have a continuous flow of trucks moving back and forth from the water supply to the drop tank to be able to fight the fire. And there's no way that you can pull enough water to be able to fight these large fires. There are things that they will do with airplanes, either using retardant chemicals or helicopters to drop specific amounts of targeted water to try and save lives or divert a fire from a given area. But generally speaking, it's impossible to stop some of these fires in certain parts of the wilderness. And so they look for natural fire breaks, such as highways or the tops of mountains that may include a cutover from where power lines have been run, where there's far less vegetation. But those natural fire breaks are a part of the strategy in terms of trying to stop the fire before it crosses some of those fire breaks and then continues to burn out of control. Again, whether it's local fire departments, trucks and firefighters, this particular picture, that kind of light green is emblematic of the U.S. Forest Service, and is kind of a symbol of, but you can see the size of the truck and you can see the size of the fire in the background. The only thing those folks can hope for is they keep the fire from crossing that road. That road becomes kind of a natural barrier to help them with a natural fire break. And again, depending on wind direction and depending on humidity, if it's been very dry, there's been a lot of drought in the area to the left of the road, and if there's change in wind direction, they're going to lose containment of that very quickly. Right now, this image would at least tell you that as it continues to move away from them, then it's going to stay contained within that area. And this is another image of how they clear away debris and creating some of these natural boundaries to create fire lines. And if you can create fire lines and fire breaks, it's a lot easier to stop the fire at that point. This is a hand crew where they've probably come in. I don't see a bulldozer or a plow. There's a large tractor type device that they use that almost looks like a bulldozer. It just doesn't really have a large blade in front. It has a plow in the back, and it's used to turn a lot of vegetation over and basically pull up dirt. And then these hand crews come through and again try to clean out a lot of the material that would be used to fuel the fire. This is another example of using a helicopter to make a water drop. This is I think this is 747 involved in dropping chemical retardant. The chemical retardants help, and they have been environmentally tested to be sure that they don't cause other problems, but the chemical retardants do help us in terms of knocking down the size of the fire or limiting how much it continues to burn. But as you can imagine, there's countless numbers of drops that need to be made to try and control some of these very large fires. This is just another picture of the smoke jumpers, also known as the hot shots. So let's kind of pivot now to business continuity. If you're operating a business and you're prone to this particular risk, it is important to have an evacuation plan for your employees. Do you need to shelter in place? That may not be ideal. It depends on what the threats are and where your location is. But it is important to note that if you're given an evacuation order, particularly as it relates to wildfire, if there's ever been a time you've heard an evacuation order that you need to obey, this is it. This is one of those times that it can move very quickly and can be very dangerous in a very short period of time. You do want to cut off gas to the building, move fuel storage away from the building. And then if people are evacuating in multiple vehicles, have a rally point. Where can they all get together later that you can account for people? If you have critical equipment, move it to the center of the building, or even better yet, take it with you if you can. And then you need to think in terms of restoring your business supply chain. What type of vendors do you need to work with? But first and foremost, protecting your employees so that, again, from a business restoration standpoint, how quickly can you restore your business really includes the important point of protecting your employees so that they're able to come back to work as well. I've included some guidelines on construction, and these are, in some cases, these are building requirements now, and in certain building code varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but areas that are more prone to wildfire today wind up being far more regulated as it reflects these types of building codes. Class A roof materials are a lot more likely to be regulated, again, with the notion that you want to manage and reduce fire risk. If you have exterior wood siding treated with fire retardant chemicals, there's a preference that the siding be something that's either slate or masonry. But again, it'll vary depending on what jurisdiction you wind up living in. And it's not to say you couldn't have bought a house that has wood siding on it that was built 20 years ago. And as the building codes have changed, obviously it doesn't mean you have to change your home, but it does mean that you may have much higher homeowners insurance if you're in an area where it's been identified at a higher risk for wildfire. Dual sensor smoke alarms, be sure that you have smoke alarms. When we talk about dual sensor, it's active for smoke and it's active for carbon monoxide. So if you're looking at your smoke alarm, the dual sensor component includes smoke and carbon monoxide. It's important to be sure that you have the dual sensor alarm. It talks about every level of your home. We have one in every one of our bedrooms. We have one in our family room, and we have one in the kitchen. And then as far as batteries, changing the batteries at least once a year. It's recommended to change the batteries either, if you're changing them once a year, a good time to remember that is whenever you're changing clocks associated with either going into or coming out of daylight savings time. Fire sprinklers. So one thing to remember about fire sprinklers, recently a friend of mine sent me a video of a apartment building fire that changed from smoke and flames visible to a 4-story structure fully involved in really a matter of about 4 minutes, 5 minutes between the time you could see the fire until the time the first arriving fire engine with a crew was, probably 5 minutes, 6 minutes, and then multiple crews continued to arrive. They had telescoping water that they could put down on the fire. And because it was in a residential area, they had lots of hydrants that they could connect to quickly. So they had good water sources. The problem was the entire structure was all wood. And to begin with, I wondered, was the building, surely the building wasn't sprinkled for it to have gotten out of control that quickly. And in exchanging messages, the person I was trading messages with was somebody I used to be involved in the fire service with. He's a fire chief in a smaller community in near the beach in North Carolina. And he said it actually had, the building was fully sprinkled, but it was sprinkled in the areas that it's required, which is the living areas. And this fire began actually began as somebody using a gas grill that was left unattended, and caught fire to the siding, and so the fire began on the outside of the structure, and then again fully involved all of the structure. Fortunately, it occurred during the daytime, in the afternoon, and people were either out of the building or it was easy to evacuate them from the building. Had that occurred at 3 o'clock in the morning, I've seen some catastrophic fires occur from cigarettes being dropped in couch cushions, and it smoldered for several hours, and then 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, it created a fire. Because the couch is pushed against the wall, the fire easily moved up the wall and into the building. And because that building wasn't sprinkled, it killed everybody in that particular building. That was actually the same fire chief in the same jurisdiction several years earlier. Some college students from South Carolina that had rented the condominium or the apartment. Anyway, the point is, there are a lot of things that you can do construction-wise to help protect yourself, and try to list that here. Again, most of this information is in building code. Whenever you're building, but if it's not in the code, these are still some things I would pay attention to in terms of what are questions I would ask in terms of construction if you're building or remodeling a building. As far as personal preparedness goes, one of the first things you can do is, again, know your evacuation areas. Just as, we live here in New Orleans, we're surrounded by water. For all practical purposes, it's an island. The only way off of the island is to cross a bridge, which crosses a body of water. So, and the challenge with that is to be able to cross a bridge means that all of the traffic, if everybody's trying to evacuate the city at the same time, there's a lot of people. It doesn't matter what bridge you're on, if you're trying to cross the causeway or you're headed toward Baton Rouge or you're headed toward Mississippi. All of those bridges are limited to 3 lanes, and so it's going to create a significant reduction in traffic being able to evacuate quickly. Well, think the same thing if you do move out west. The limited number of highways will also limit the amount of area that people can drive on to be able to evacuate an area. And so know your evacuation route so that you don't get trapped. Understand where you are. Monitor local news and radio. Again, the National Weather Service issues, just as they issue weather warnings here, they issue weather, which includes wildfire warnings in areas that are more prone to it. In terms of evacuation, if you're ordered to evacuate, just to understand this can move very quickly. If you're told to get out, it's time to get out. In terms of evacuation, I've included a couple of pictures just to give you an idea of just how quickly this can grow. What are things that you need to be sure that you're doing? In terms of if you're in your vehicle probably has a selection of fresh air or recirculating interior air. Be sure that you're recirculating interior air. Roll up the windows, close exterior air vents. Drive slowly with your headlights, watch out for other vehicles, and avoid driving in heavy smoke, which will substantially reduce visibility. It may be necessary to drive with a mask on, depending on, again, how quickly the smoke starts to settle into the area where you're evacuating. I would not wear a mask while I'm driving unless I have smoke coming into the car. If you're not ordered to evacuate, but smoky conditions exist, again, just understand your surroundings and understand how, what are the things you need to do to quickly evacuate. I do have a list of things to do. Let's go ahead and move to that. Turn lights on outside and in every room to make your house more visible in heavy smoke. And again, why that's important is if there are people involved in rescue or people involved in trying to save structures, they will identify that your house is there. Again, firefighters involved in a response to this will have to make some calculated decisions on what to save, what to defend, and what to let burn. But if they don't know your house is there, it's going to be tough for them to know that there's a house there for us to defend. Close the windows, close the vents and doors, the fireplace screens, disconnect the automatic garage door opener so doors can be opened by hand if you lose power. And if you have an automatic garage door opener, there's typically a place that's got a pull cord on it. If you just pull that down, it'll make it easier for you to be able to lift the garage door up and pull it back down. The 5 P's of evacuation, very important: people, personal needs, priceless items, prescriptions, and papers. And so, and when we talk about people, we're also talking about pets. And sometimes we don't mention that, but I can tell you, just, from my own personal experience, we have a couple of pets that are very near and dear to us, and we're not going anywhere without them. We're not staying somewhere without them. And just an experience we had. We have 2 cats that have lived with us for a number of years, and we needed to live in a hotel for about a week while our home was being remodeled. Long story, but the short of it is we looked for a couple of hotels that were pet friendly, and so I contacted one of them, and he said, yeah, sure, no problem. We're a pet friendly hotel. There's a non-refundable deposit of, however many dollars. And I said, that's fine. And he said, by the way, when you're saying pet, what are you talking about? I said, well, we have 2 cats. I said, but they're, they're well behaved. They're litter box trained. They're docile. He said, I'm sorry, we don't do cats. When we say pets, we mean dogs and only dogs. And so the reason I point that out is, again, if a part of your evacuation plan includes taking care of your pets, and that may include driving to a public hotel, understanding that their definition of pets and our definition of pets may be 2 different things. They may only think of dogs as pets. So anyway, I just point that out. Personal needs. One other thing in terms of animals, if you're operating a small farm, or if you have horses as an example, most people have friends that they can rely on where they can take horses. Obviously, if you own horses, you probably have a horse trailer. Just yourself, if you've ever tried to get horses into a trailer, or particularly with livestock, if you've ever tried to get a couple of cows into a trailer, that's going to take time. So you know, if you're going to need to evacuate and take animals with you, just account for that, because that can really extend the amount of time involved in what you need to do. Personal needs, think about what are things that you really need to take with you. Cash is important. One of the things that we ran into with a number of disasters I've been involved in, and responding to those disasters is, you know, if I get to the disaster several days after the disasters occurred, even if they've restored the power to a teller machine, as an example, in most cases the teller machines have already distributed all the money that they have. People have withdrawn all of the cash that was in the teller machine. And so there may be an extended period of time that cash is not available. And I realize cash is not always easy for you to store some at home, but in terms of evacuating, I would think about having, you know, what type of cash needs I would have and how do I take care of that. If you can evacuate into areas that are not affected by the disaster, then you're going to be okay with your plastic. But if you're evacuating an area still affected by the disaster, cash may be the only thing you have that works well. Phones and chargers, I can't tell you enough the importance of chargers, and chargers that work off of your car battery, as well as wall chargers. And then what types of needs do you have if you have family members who have certain disabilities or functional needs, or those with limited English proficiency. Again, think about how you're going to be able to take care of those people with those needs who are your family members. These priceless items, you know, there's only a handful of things in my house that if somebody told me I had 30 minutes to get out of my house, that it's going to be overrun by fire. There's only a handful of things that are really important to me that I'd like to take. But what I would encourage you to do is to think about, what are those valuables? What are the things that are in your home that you would consider priceless? You know, 99.9% of what I live in, if it was burned down tomorrow, I would be sad, but you know, most all of it could be built back. There are a handful of little things that I would like to take with me, just simply because it's been passed down through family members, and you know, they're irreplaceable mementos. But one thing to remember about the word irreplaceable, the only thing really irreplaceable is you, or your family members. The rest of it's stuff. It's stuff that I'd like to keep, but it's not ultimately anything more than stuff. Prescriptions are essential, particularly if you're dealing with somebody with diabetes, or medications that have to be refrigerated. Think in the context of taking a small cooler with you. The other piece that's not really included in this, in prescriptions, but in terms of medical needs, if a member of your family requires dialysis, what are places that you could evacuate to where dialysis would be available? But again, just think in context of what you have, you know, and just knowing how some prescriptions are written on a month-to-month basis. How much extra medication do you have? Do you have an extra prescription that as you evacuate, somebody else could fill for you, or you could fill for yourself at a different pharmacy? Again, just think through that. And then what type of important papers? Most everything today can be scanned and kept on a thumb drive. I don't have one here to show you right offhand, but I actually have a very small thumb drive now that fits on my key ring, and a lot of documents that are important documents actually stay on my key ring with me. If you're trapped in a vehicle, again, what are things that you can do to protect yourself? You know, if you're pulling something or towing something, you may need to drop it just to be able to, again, continue to evacuate. If you want to stay away from fuel sources. If you have to leave the vehicle, try to find a water source. In fact, I think I've included it. If I haven't, I'll show you a couple of examples of people who have survived being overcome by a wildfire by actually going into their swimming pool and staying in their swimming pool, or going into a body of water. Again, just understand that body of water in most cases will be colder than the air temperature, and as your body begins to lose heat, actually can lead to hypothermia. So again, just another challenge to think about, but you're going to be safer if you can get in a body of water, if you have to leave your vehicle. Also, as opposed to going up or going down, in all likelihood, the fire is going to travel up the hill much faster than it's going to travel down the hill. So again, what are your options in terms of escaping the fire? Dialing 911, try to explain your location and your situation. If they have someone that can help you, they certainly will. But again, depending on the size and nature of the fire, that may be a bit problematic. Then in terms of having an emergency kit, what are things that you want to be sure that you're not left without? Just as, you know, when there's a hurricane forecast here, we all go, I hope we all go to the gas station and fill up our cars with gas. I would encourage you to do the same thing there. What are things that you keep in your vehicle? Again, I can't tell you enough the importance of having a spare, keeping an old cell phone and an old charger. Even if you can't call anybody on it, you can dial 911 on it. All old cell phones must still be compatible with a signal that they can dial 911 on. And so it's one more way that you can have an alternative form of communication. And actually, as far as traction, tire traction, if you're in an area that where either because of mud or because of snow, cat litter or sand works really well for tire traction. What else do we want to talk about? Just a handful of things in terms of precautions to protect your home and protect your business. Again, these are a couple of images of pools. I don't think I included the story, but one of these pools was actually a location where a husband and wife stayed in the pool for several hours as the fire destroyed their home and burned over top of them, but allowed them to be able to save their life. Again, respiratory protection is the biggest issue. If you're going to be in and around a wildfire area, the amount of smoke is just extraordinary. And so again, COVID-19 has reintroduced us to what it's like to have, or introduced us to what it's like to have some type of face mask in our life. This is certainly one of those times that having face mask and maybe multiple face mask wearing is a way to help protect yourself from inhaling some of the smoke particles associated with the smoke. Yeah, actually here is an N95. Respiratory protection is really a big deal as it relates to being in a wildfire type area. I wouldn't wear one until I needed one, but when I needed one, I'd be sure to have one. And again, these are different images of smoke or respiratory protection. I will say that there are a number of countries, and China is particularly one of them, where because of industrial a byproduct of using a lot of coal for industrial production, they've wound up with a lot of air quality issues. And to help deal with air quality issues, you see a lot of people wearing masks on a regular basis. Um, I, and I would say the same thing exists in some parts of India, but more of the industrialized nations that don't have, that have focused a lot on using coal for energy production. So again, it gives you an idea of smoky conditions and how they use respiratory protection. What else do we want to be sure and talk about? Try not to use any type of indoor combustible. And the reason I say that, whether I'm talking about candles or fireplaces or gas stoves, what that actually could do is it could also consume, for a fire to burn, it requires oxygen, and there may be limited amounts of oxygen in the air because of the smoke. Adding additional fire to an area like that may actually consume additional oxygen and actually make it very difficult for people to breathe, particularly those with some type of pre-existing respiratory condition. Don't sweep or vacuum, that can stir up particles in the home. When an all clear is given, be sure to exercise due caution in going back into the areas, primarily looking for water, gas, and electricity. How has it been restored? Is anything down, like an electric line? Has anything been disconnected, such as a gas line? Before you leave your home or before you leave your business, at the meter, turn the gas off. As you return, somebody needs to check for the safety of that before reactivating that. Just some additional tips on protecting your business and protecting your home. And again, just that last point before we wrap up for today, and that is wildfire can lead to substantial flooding and landslides, particularly in areas where the topography is pretty dramatic, where there's a lot of hills, a lot of mountains. As the wildfire has burned away a significant part of the vegetation. Actually, I've got an image of that. Yeah, it suddenly, there's not a lot of place for the water to be absorbed, and the ash also acts as somewhat of a water repellent, so that the water runs off the hill in a pretty dramatic way. So flooding after a fire, if there's substantial rainfall in the days or weeks to come following a substantial wildfire, there is a much greater chance of flash flooding and potentially a mudslide. So key pieces: we can control the wildland urban interface, and we can do that with zoning. We can control construction standards. We can't control for geography and topography. Not all of these things have a direct correlation, but it is important to understand what our risks are. And then again, these things really aren't a risk here in the greater New Orleans area, but depending on where you are, either in the United States or in the world, is to understand, what your risks are. If you're in an area that has a lot of mountains, a lot of wind, and has low humidity and a lot of drought, you're far more likely to be at risk for wildfire. And so what type of pre-planning can you do for something like that? Just understand the importance of that. And I think that's it. So again, if you have any questions, be sure and send me an email. I've got a couple of other images here, just again reminding you how substantial these things can be, and how catastrophic they can become. The big picture with wildfire, again, is if you're given an order to evacuate, please evacuate immediately. Okay, I hope you have a good day. I'll see you next week on Zoom.